Fun fact about the Titanic. So I'm sure you remember this dude who tells Margaret Brown to shut that hole in her face. Well, he represented a real crew member on the Titanic. This is Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, and he was the guy who was at the wheel when the Titanic struck the iceberg. When the order came in, he immediately swung the wheel as far as it would go, but as we all know, the ship hit the iceberg. Now, Quartermaster Hitchens would become infamous because of the actions he took later that night. During the evacuation, he was put in charge of lifeboat number 6, which happens to be the same lifeboat that Margaret Brown, or the unsinkable Molly Brown, was on. And the women on the boat would later criticize him for being a coward and being extremely negative the whole night. They claimed that he was yelling and criticizing everybody who was rowing the boat while he was at the tiller. They also claimed that he refused to go back and pick up more people even when the captain ordered them to. This is what we actually see here in this deleted scene. The captain asked him to come back and he says, "No, it's our lives now, not theirs." And it's believed Margaret Brown was so fed up she threatened to throw him overboard, not the other way around. Titanic Fact. So we all know the story of Titanic's band that played until the very end, which is 100% true. Now let me tell you a little bit more about the orchestra. Titanic had 8 musicians led by a man named Wallace Hartley, and there were actually 2 ensembles. There was a 5-person string ensemble, and then there was also a 3-person trio that included a pianist. They provided regular entertainment in various first-class areas of the ship, and many passengers remember them being wonderfully cooperative with requests. They could play any selection from memory from the White Star Songbook, and there were 350 songs. After the collision, they began playing in the first-class lounge, then moved to the boat deck foyer, and finally out onto the deck itself. They played lighthearted tunes, and many survivors later claimed that the music truly kept a certain level of calm and really prevented panic until the very last moment. Now, the final song they played is a very heavily debated topic, but most agree that it was a Methodist version of Near My God to Thee. Unfortunately, all 8 men died that night. However, Hartley's body was later recovered. It was sent back to England, where an estimated 30,000 people gave him a true hero's farewell. Time for another Titanic fact. Okay, let's talk about the guy who spotted the iceberg that night. His name was Frederick Fleet. He was 24 years old, and he was one of 6 lookouts working on the Titanic. On the night of April 14th, he was in the crow's nest on duty with another lookout named Reginald Lee when he spotted the iceberg. As soon as he spotted it, he rang the bell 3 times, phoned the bridge, and uttered his famous words, "Iceberg right ahead." The ship immediately started turning before he was even off the phone, and it's believed that 37 seconds later, Titanic hit the iceberg. After the collision, both lookouts weren't even sure if the ship had actually hit, so they remained in the crow's nest for 20 minutes. Fleet then went to the boat deck, where he was ordered by Second Officer Lightoller into lifeboat number 6 to help out. And yeah, you may recognize boat number 6 because it carried the famous unsinkable Molly Brown and Quartermaster Hitchens, who I've talked about in previous videos. And Fleet is featured a little bit here in this deleted scene. Now, after the sinking, he lived with terrible guilt, and unfortunately in 1965, he took his own life after the death of his wife. Many consider him to be the true last victim of Titanic. Chances are you probably know of the unsinkable Molly Brown, but you may not be aware of another Titanic survivor that could probably hold that very same title. Let me introduce you to Violet Jessop, who was a nurse that survived disasters on all 3 sister ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. She was on board the Olympic when it crashed, and she lived through the sinking of the Titanic and the Britannic. So in 1911, Violet was a stewardess on the Olympic when it crashed with the ship HMS Hawk. The ship itself didn't sink, it just received significant damage, as you can see here, and Violet herself was completely uninjured. Then in 1912, her friends convinced her to take a stewardess job, this time on the Titanic, and of course we all know what happened with the Titanic. Violet again survived and was placed in a lifeboat 16. Fun fact, she was actually handed a baby to take care of on the lifeboat, and then eventually she reunited it with her mother. And finally, in 1916, Violet was serving as a nurse on the Britannic when it started to sink, and she was actually in one of the lifeboats that almost got crushed by a propeller, but she managed to jump out just in time. So there you have it, the truly unsinkable Violet Jessop. Fun fact about the Titanic. Do you guys remember the officer who let Fabrizio and Jack on at the very last minute? Well, he played 6th Officer James Moody, who was the most junior of all of Titanic's officers. And he was really in charge of closing that final gangway. And it's actually believed that he turned away 6 crewmen who arrived late and probably saved their lives. On the night of the sinking, Moody was on the bridge and picked up the phone when the iceberg warning came in. And we see that portrayed here in the Cameron film as well. During the evacuation, Moody helped to load the port side boats, particularly boats 12, 14, and 16. Now, interesting story here, when they were loading lifeboat number 14, 5th Officer Lowe commented that there weren't any officers in that boat. Moody, who was the lower ranking officer, should have gone on that boat, but he told Lowe to go on instead. It was this simple action that saved 5th Officer Lowe's life. Moody was last seen helping officers free up those 2 collapsible boats as the water washed on deck. Moody died that night, but today in Scarborough, England, there's a memorial commemorating his heroism. Fun fact, did you know the Titanic almost crashed before her journey even began? It's actually true. As she was setting sail for New York, she almost collided with another ship, ironically also called the New York. Okay, so basically what happened is, as the Titanic was leaving her port in Southampton, she passed by two ships that were moored side by side, the Oceanic and the New York. The suction created as she passed by pulled the ship until her rope snapped and the stern of the New York swung toward the Titanic. Titanic's engines were immediately put into reverse to try to slow the swing of the New York. At this point, it looked like the collision was inevitable, but right before the two ships collided, a tugboat was able to secure a rope around the stern of the New York and hold the ship back before it actually hit. At that point in time, the New York swung forward and then around to move out of the way of the Titanic. This entire incident caused a 1-hour delay in the departure, and many passengers saw it as a bad omen, as bad luck. The fact that the final destination was New York and the ship they almost crashed into was also called the New York. As we know, Titanic never made it to New York. Here's another Titanic fact. In the movie, do you remember the officer blowing the whistle in the water that Rose eventually uses to save herself? Well, he represents a real-life officer on the Titanic. He plays Chief Officer Henry Wilde, who was the most senior officer besides a captain. Fun fact, he was actually switched onto the Titanic at the very last minute. He came on as chief officer, forcing the other senior officers to move down in rank. In a letter, he also claimed he wasn't a big fan of the Titanic. He got a strange feeling. After the collision with the iceberg, Chief Officer Wilde accompanied Mr. Andrews to do an inspection of the ship. Now, not much is known about his actions during the sinking, but what we do know is that he was working on the port side with Second Officer Lightoller to get those boats ready. He also reportedly ordered Lightoller to show him where the guns and ammunition were kept, and then he handed them out to senior officers and he said, quote, "You may need it." Unfortunately, Officer Wilde died that night, but most say that he was last seen helping with those final collapsibles at the front of the ship. Here in the movie, we see him loading that final boat that Rose jumps out of. Tragically, his wife had also died 2 years prior, so his 4 children were left orphaned, and today in Liverpool there's a memorial in his honor. Fun fact about the Titanic. Did you know the Titanic's 4th smokestack was actually fake? It was a dummy smokestack. It didn't actually function as a smokestack. She only really required 3, and as you can see here, only the first 3 were connected to the furnaces, which actually produces smoke. Now, what was the purpose of the 4th one? So basically it provided some air ventilation, some smoke or steam would emit from this funnel. Also, Titanic's rival ships, the Mauretania and the Lusitania, they both had 4 funnels. So the White Star Line included that 4th funnel to add to the grandeur and the overall luxury of the ship. There was even a fireman's ladder in that 4th funnel, so it could be climbed. So if you ever wondered why in all the drawings and pictures you only see smoke in the first 3 funnels, well, it's because the 4th was fake. Do you remember that man in Titanic who said, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down as gentlemen"?
But we would like a brandy.
Well, he plays the real-life Benjamin Guggenheim, who was an American businessman and millionaire. He was traveling back to the US with his valet and his mistress. His wife was back at home, and they even talk about it here in the movie. Her name was Madame O'Barr. She was 24 years old, he was 46. After the collision, he went up on the boat deck and made sure his mistress and her servant were put into a lifeboat. However, when he realized the gravity of the situation, he decided to return to his room to change into his best clothing. This was reported by his bedroom steward who survived the sinking, which is why we see it featured in so many other Titanic movies. He also then wrote a goodbye letter to his wife and gave it to that steward, saying, "If anything should happen to me, tell my wife I've done my best in my duty." Mr. Guggenheim did not survive the night, but thanks to his steward, we know that he was dressed in his best and went down like a gentleman.